He thought he had prepared for every crisis money could solve, but nothing in his empire had taught him how to quiet the tears of his own son. The sound of little Noah Romano crying had swallowed every elegant note drifting through Bella Vista, the most exclusive Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above tables dressed in white linen. Polished silver reflected warm candlelight, and conversations that had filled the dining room only minutes earlier slowly faded into uneasy whispers. Every guest recognized Ethan Romano the moment he entered with his 4-year-old son. Some admired him from a distance. Others quietly avoided looking his way, but everyone understood one simple truth. Powerful men rarely appeared helpless. Yet tonight, Ethan sat perfectly still in a tailored charcoal suit, while Noah buried his face against his father's shoulder, sobbing with a desperation that seemed too heavy for someone so small. The child had refused dinner, refused water, refused every toy his security team had rushed out to buy from nearby boutiques. A private pediatrician had already checked him earlier that afternoon and found nothing physically wrong. The restaurant manager had dimmed the lights. A musician had stopped playing. A pastry chef had hurried into the kitchen to prepare fresh desserts shaped like cartoon animals. Nothing changed. Noah's cries only grew louder, echoing against marble columns and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. Ethan's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with exhaustion. 3 sleepless nights had left faint shadows beneath his eyes, shadows no expensive suit could hide. His son had barely spoken all week, and now every attempt to comfort him seemed to push him further away. Bodyguards exchanged uncertain glances, uncertain which was more intimidating, a room full of anxious millionaires or a father who had quietly run out of answers. Across the dining room, Ava Brooks balanced a tray of sparkling water with practiced grace. 27 years old, dressed in the restaurant's simple black uniform with a neatly tied apron, she moved through the room almost unnoticed, the way experienced servers often did. She believed good service meant making other people feel important, never herself. But as she passed table 12 for the 3rd time, something pulled her attention toward the little boy. It wasn't the crying itself. It was the pattern hidden beneath it. Noah squeezed his eyes shut every time glasses clinked together. His tiny shoulders stiffened whenever another chair scraped across the hardwood floor. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to make him flinch. Ava slowed her steps almost without realizing it. She watched him cover one ear with his small hand while pressing the other side of his face into his father's jacket. Her heartbeat changed. It reminded her of someone she had known long before she ever carried trays through crowded dining rooms. She looked toward Ethan, whose expression had become a mixture of determination and quiet heartbreak, the kind only a parent could wear. For a long moment, she remained exactly where she was, weighing the cost of interrupting one of the most powerful men in the city against the silent certainty growing inside her. Then she carefully set the tray onto a nearby service station, folded her trembling hands together to steady them, took one slow breath, and walked toward the table, already knowing something no one else in that room had noticed. Ava stopped a respectful distance from the table and waited until Ethan looked up. His attention shifted from Noah's trembling shoulders to the young waitress standing quietly before him. She did not rush to speak, and she did not force a smile. She simply met his exhausted expression with calm eyes that carried neither fear nor curiosity. "Sir," she said gently, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. "May I ask you one unusual question?" Ethan studied her for a long second. Most people approached him hoping to impress him, flatter him, or ask for something. She seemed interested in none of those things. "What is it?" he answered, his voice rough from hours of trying to comfort his son. Ava glanced toward Noah before looking back at Ethan. "May I borrow his shoes for just a moment?" The question landed in the silence like a pebble dropped into still water. The restaurant manager stared at her in disbelief. One of Ethan's security guards instinctively stepped forward before Ethan lifted a single hand, stopping him without taking his eyes off Ava. "His shoes," Ethan repeated quietly. "Yes, sir," Ava answered. "I know it sounds strange, but I believe it might help me understand what is making him so uncomfortable." Several nearby diners exchanged confused looks. Someone whispered that the waitress had lost her mind. Another guest shook his head as if expecting Ethan to dismiss her immediately. Instead, Ethan looked down at Noah again. The little boy had buried his face even deeper into his father's shoulder, his breathing uneven, his small fingers gripping the expensive fabric of Ethan's jacket so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. Ethan realized that every solution offered that evening had involved giving Noah something new. New toys, new food, new distractions. No one had stopped to truly observe him. Ava had. "You have 1 minute," Ethan finally said. Ava nodded with quiet gratitude. She slowly knelt several feet away instead of moving directly toward Noah. She did not reach for him or ask him to look at her. Instead, she spoke softly to Ethan. "Would you mind taking off his shoes yourself?" Ethan carefully loosened the small sneakers and slipped them off his son's feet. The moment they came free, Ava noticed Noah immediately curling his toes against his father's pant leg. She nodded almost to herself. Then she looked at the tiny socks covering his feet. "May I ask one more favor?" Ethan gave another silent nod. "Would you remove the socks too?" Again he complied. Noah's crying did not stop, but its rhythm changed. His shoulders relaxed ever so slightly as his bare feet rested against the smooth leather seat. Ava smiled almost imperceptibly. She had seen this before years ago. She reached into the pocket of her apron and carefully unfolded a clean cotton dinner napkin. Placing it on the floor beside the booth, she gently slid it forward without touching the child. Noah slowly lowered one foot onto the soft fabric. Then the other. The crying became quieter. Not gone, but softer, as though something inside him had finally loosened. No one in the dining room dared to speak. Ethan stared at his son with growing disbelief before lifting his eyes toward Ava, silently asking the question everyone else was thinking. "How did you know to do that?" The room remained perfectly still as Noah kept both feet resting on the folded cotton napkin. His sobs no longer echoed across the restaurant. They faded into quiet, uneven breaths, each one calmer than the last. Ethan hardly dared to move, afraid that even the smallest interruption might break whatever invisible thread Ava had discovered. One by one, the conversations around the dining room disappeared until the only sounds left were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of dishes being cleared from another section. Noah slowly lifted his head from his father's shoulder for the first time that evening. His cheeks were still damp with tears, but the panic that had overwhelmed his face only moments earlier had begun to soften. His eyes drifted downward toward the napkin beneath his bare feet, and he gently pressed his toes against the soft fabric as though testing something that finally felt right. Ava stayed exactly where she was. She resisted every instinct to explain herself or celebrate what had happened. She understood that trust was fragile, especially with frightened children. Sometimes the greatest kindness was giving them space instead of attention. Ethan watched her carefully. Most adults rushed toward silence, filling it with praise or questions the moment a child calmed down. Ava didn't either. She simply waited. After nearly a full minute, Noah took one long, steady breath and quietly whispered, "Better." It was only one word, barely louder than the flickering candle on the table, yet it struck Ethan harder than any speech ever could. His son had spoken. The manager blinked in disbelief. One of the servers quietly covered her mouth with both hands. Even the security team exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they had truly witnessed what they thought they had. Ethan looked at Noah before slowly turning back toward Ava. "What did you see that none of us saw?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than authority. Ava hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I noticed he reacted every time something touched him unexpectedly," she answered softly. The shoes looked a little tight after such a long evening, and sometimes when children become overwhelmed, removing one source of discomfort helps their bodies begin to relax. "I was not certain. I only hoped." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the tiny sneakers resting beside the booth. He realized Noah had been wearing them since early that morning through meetings, travel, and a long charity event before dinner. Not once had anyone considered something so simple. They had searched for complicated answers because they assumed a complicated problem. Noah gently rubbed the napkin between his toes again and then looked toward Ava with quiet curiosity instead of fear. She offered him the smallest smile, careful not to overwhelm him. He did not smile back yet, but he did not look away either. For Ethan, that tiny change felt enormous. The powerful businessman who negotiated million-dollar agreements with absolute confidence suddenly found himself humbled by a waitress whose greatest strength seemed to be paying attention. As the restaurant slowly breathed back to life and guests cautiously resumed their conversations, Ethan realized he no longer saw Ava as another employee carrying trays through the dining room. For the first time since she had approached the table, he found himself wondering not who she worked for, but what kind of life had taught her to notice the things everyone else had overlooked. Later that night, long after the last guests had finished dessert and the dining room had returned to its usual elegance, Ava quietly folded fresh linens in the service hallway while replaying the evening in her mind. She had never expected anyone to notice what she had done, and she certainly had not expected Ethan Romano to look at her with genuine curiosity instead of quiet suspicion. She hoped the little boy was finally resting peacefully. That hope stayed with her during the drive home to her modest apartment on the south side, where the city lights faded behind rows of familiar brick buildings and quiet streets. As she unlocked her front door, her eyes immediately settled on a framed photograph resting beside the entryway. The picture showed a smiling teenage boy standing beside her, both laughing at something outside the frame. His name was Caleb Brooks, her younger brother. When Caleb was 6 years old, ordinary sounds had often become overwhelming. School bells, crowded grocery stores, scratchy clothing tags, even the buzzing of fluorescent lights could leave him frightened and unable to explain why. Their mother had worked double shifts as a nursing assistant, leaving Ava, only 13 herself, to learn through patience instead of textbooks. Night after night, she discovered that comfort rarely came from talking more. It came from observing more. She learned that Caleb hated stiff shoes after long days. She learned that soft cotton blankets calmed him better than expensive toys. She learned that lowering her own voice often encouraged him to lower his breathing. None of those lessons had come from professional training. They came from years of loving someone enough to notice details everyone else dismissed. Caleb had eventually grown into a confident young man who studied graphic design and lived independently, but those years had quietly transformed Ava forever. She never spoke about them because they were not achievements she believed deserved praise. They were simply part of being family. The next morning, she arrived at Bella Vista before sunrise as she always did. Fresh flowers were being arranged. Coffee beans filled the air with their rich aroma, and servers prepared silverware for another busy day. Nothing seemed different until the restaurant manager approached her with an unusually careful expression. "Ava," he said softly, "someone is waiting for you in the private dining room." She looked toward the closed oak doors at the end of the hallway, confused. She had never been invited there before. For a brief moment, she wondered whether she had accidentally broken restaurant policy by approaching Ethan's table without permission. Taking a slow breath, she walked toward the room and gently opened the door. Ethan Romano stood beside the window overlooking the river, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, yet somehow looking far less intimidating than the night before. Noah stood quietly beside him, holding a small stuffed fox beneath one arm instead of crying. The little boy noticed Ava first. He hesitated for only a second before giving her a small, cautious wave. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But to Ethan, who had not seen that simple gesture offered to a stranger in weeks, it felt more valuable than anything money had ever purchased. As Ava stepped inside, she had no idea that the conversation waiting for her was about to change the direction of all three of their lives. The private dining room felt quieter than the bustling restaurant outside, as though the city itself had paused beyond the tall windows. Ava stood respectfully near the entrance, unsure why she had been invited. Ethan motioned toward an empty chair, but she remained standing. "You are not in trouble," he said with the faintest hint of understanding crossing his face. "If anything, I owe you my thanks." Ava smiled politely. "Seeing Noah feeling better is more than enough for me." Ethan glanced at his son, who sat comfortably beside the window tracing circles on the glass with one finger while holding his stuffed fox close against his chest. The change from the previous evening was impossible to ignore. His breathing was calm, his shoulders relaxed, and every few moments he quietly looked toward Ava as if making sure she was still there. Ethan folded his hands together. "After we left the restaurant, Noah slept through the entire night for the first time in almost 2 weeks. His voice remained steady, yet gratitude softened every word. This morning he ate breakfast without a struggle." Ava's eyes brightened. "That is wonderful to hear." Ethan studied her carefully. For years, he had built his life by reading people before they spoke, measuring motives before offering trust. Yet the young woman standing before him refused to fit into any pattern he recognized. She had not asked for recognition. She had not mentioned money. She had not even told anyone what she had done after leaving the restaurant. Quietly, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded sheet of paper. "I hope you do not mind," he said. "I asked someone to learn a little about you." Ava looked surprised but not offended. Ethan continued before she could respond. "You have worked here for nearly 4 years. You have never been late. You regularly trade shifts so co-workers can attend family events. Every month you volunteer at a neighborhood literacy program for elementary school children. You help your mother with household expenses, and every Sunday you visit your younger brother for lunch." Ava lowered her eyes, embarrassed rather than impressed. "There is nothing unusual about any of that." Ethan gave a thoughtful smile. "That is exactly what surprised me." He had expected to uncover specialized training, advanced certifications, or some hidden professional background that explained what had happened the night before. Instead, every conversation with restaurant employees described the same woman: reliable, kind, patient, quiet. The more he searched, the fewer mysteries he found. Somehow that made her even more remarkable. Noah slowly climbed down from his chair and walked across the room with cautious steps. He stopped a few feet from Ava before looking down at the stuffed fox in his hands. Without speaking, he gently held it toward her. Ava accepted the toy for only a moment before carefully placing it back into his hands. "I think he feels safest with you," she whispered. Noah nodded once and hugged the fox again. Ethan watched the exchange in complete silence. No instructions, no rewards, no pressure, just trust growing naturally between a frightened child and a woman who had simply taken the time to notice him. For the first time in many years, Ethan realized that the rarest gift anyone had ever offered his family was not expertise or influence. It was genuine attention, freely given without expecting anything in return. Over the next several days, Ethan found himself noticing changes that no report or medical chart had ever captured. Noah no longer covered his ears the moment he entered a busy room. Breakfast became something he accepted, instead of resisted. Bedtime no longer stretched into endless hours of restless pacing through the mansion. There were still difficult moments, but they arrived with less intensity and passed with far less fear. Curious rather than satisfied, Ethan arranged a meeting with Dr. Melissa Grant, the developmental pediatric specialist who had been caring for Noah for nearly a year. Seated in her bright office overlooking Lake Michigan, Ethan carefully described everything that had happened at the restaurant, including the simple decision to remove Noah's shoes and let his feet rest on the soft cotton napkin. Dr. Grant listened without interrupting, occasionally making a few thoughtful notes before leaning back in her chair. "What your waitress noticed," she explained gently, "was not magic. It was observation. Children who experience sensory processing challenges can become overwhelmed by discomfort that most people never notice. Tight shoes after a long day, unfamiliar fabrics, constant noise, bright lights, crowded rooms. One small irritation may seem insignificant by itself, but together they can become unbearable." Ethan remained silent, replaying every moment of that evening in his mind. "She also did something equally important," Dr. Grant continued. "She never rushed toward Noah. She gave him control. She allowed him to discover comfort instead of forcing comfort onto him. That often makes an enormous difference." Ethan looked toward the window as the realization slowly settled over him. For months he had searched for expensive solutions while overlooking simple understanding. Every specialist had offered valuable guidance. Yet in the middle of a crowded restaurant, a woman with no formal title had recognized Noah's distress because she truly watched him. That afternoon, Ethan returned to his office carrying more questions than answers. He found Noah quietly building a tower of wooden blocks on the living room rug. The little boy looked up as his father entered. "Daddy," Noah said softly, "my feet feel better today." Ethan smiled and sat beside him on the floor, something he had not done during a workday in longer than he cared to admit. "I am glad." "They do," he answered. Noah carefully placed another block on top of the tower. Miss Ava listened. The simple sentence lingered in the room long after Noah returned his attention to the blocks. Not she fixed me. Not she saved me. She listened. Those two words echoed through Ethan's thoughts for the rest of the afternoon. As evening approached, he stood alone in his study overlooking the city skyline, watching the lights gradually brighten across Chicago. He realized that gratitude alone no longer felt sufficient. Ava had given his son something that no amount of influence had been able to provide. She had noticed the child behind the tears. Ethan reached for his phone, paused for a long moment, and then asked his assistant to contact Bella Vista. He did not want to reward Ava with money or an extravagant gift. What he wanted was something far more meaningful. He wanted to ask whether she would be willing to spend time with Noah again, not because she owed them anything, but because for the first time in months, his son had found someone who made the world feel a little less overwhelming. Ava never expected the phone call that arrived the following afternoon. She had just finished setting tables for the dinner service when the restaurant manager approached with an expression that mixed surprise and respect. "There is someone on the line asking for you," he said quietly. "It is Mr. Romano." Ava stepped into the small office near the kitchen and answered with a polite greeting. Ethan's familiar voice came through the receiver, calm and measured. "I hope I am not interrupting your work." "Not at all, sir," she replied. "I wanted to ask something important," Ethan continued. "Noah has been doing remarkably well since we met you. I know you have your own life and your own responsibilities, so please understand that there is absolutely no obligation. But would you consider spending a few afternoons each week with him? Not as a nanny, not as a therapist, simply as someone he already trusts." Ava remained silent for several seconds. The request touched her heart, yet it also filled her with uncertainty. "I appreciate your confidence," she answered honestly, "but I am only a waitress. I do not have professional qualifications for that kind of responsibility." Ethan responded without hesitation. "Perhaps, but qualifications taught many people how to treat my son. You reminded me how to see him." Those words stayed with Ava long after the conversation ended. That evening she visited her mother after work, just as she did every Thursday. Sitting around the small kitchen table with homemade chicken soup between them, Ava shared everything that had happened. Her mother listened quietly before smiling with gentle pride. "You have always believed that kindness is never wasted," she said. "Maybe this little boy simply needs someone who makes him feel understood." Ava looked down at her bowl. "I am afraid of disappointing them." "Then you are already thinking about the right person," her mother replied. "You are thinking about the child instead of yourself." 2 days later, Ava accepted Ethan's invitation to visit the Romano home for a single afternoon. She made it clear that she would continue working at the restaurant and could only come on her days off. Ethan respected every condition without negotiation. When Ava arrived at the elegant stone mansion overlooking the lake, she felt completely out of place. The polished floors, towering windows, and carefully tended gardens reflected a world very different from the neighborhood where she had grown up. Yet Noah did not seem to notice any of those differences. The moment he spotted her through the front window, he quietly picked up his stuffed fox and hurried toward the front door with a smile that reached his eyes before it reached his lips. He stopped just in front of her and whispered, "You came." Ava knelt to his level and smiled warmly. "I told your father I would visit today." Noah nodded and gently took her hand without saying another word. Ethan watched from the foyer, saying nothing as they walked together toward the family room. In that simple moment, he understood something he had missed for far too long. Trust could not be demanded, purchased, or scheduled. It had to be earned one patient moment at a time, and somehow, without ever trying to impress anyone, Ava Brooks had already earned the trust of the person who mattered most. For several weeks, an easy rhythm settled into the Romano household. Ava visited every Tuesday and Saturday afternoon, never trying to replace anyone, never pretending to have all the answers. She simply listened, observed, and allowed Noah to move through the world at his own pace. Together they planted herbs in the garden, built small towers from wooden blocks, read picture books beneath the shade of an old oak tree, and counted sailboats drifting across the lake. Ethan watched those quiet afternoons from a distance whenever work allowed, slowly realizing that the greatest changes often happened without applause. Then one Saturday morning, everything seemed to unravel again. Ethan had promised Noah a visit to the city's Natural History Museum before it opened to the general public. The museum staff had reserved a quiet hour, hoping the calmer environment would make the visit easier. At first, everything went well. Noah smiled as he examined dinosaur fossils, and carefully traced the outlines of colorful butterflies displayed behind glass. But as another school group unexpectedly entered the building earlier than scheduled, the peaceful atmosphere disappeared. Excited voices echoed through the wide halls. Shoes tapped rapidly across polished stone floors. A nearby exhibit began playing an educational video at a volume much louder than anyone expected. Noah instantly froze. His breathing became shallow. He pressed both hands tightly over his ears and squeezed his eyes shut. Ethan immediately guided him toward a quieter corner, speaking with calm reassurance. But Noah could no longer hear his father's words through the overwhelming rush of sounds surrounding him. Museum staff quickly lowered the volume of the exhibit, yet the tension continued to build. Ethan felt the familiar helplessness returning. Then he noticed Ava quietly walking toward them. She had arrived a few minutes earlier after accepting Ethan's invitation to meet them there, but instead of rushing forward, she paused several feet away until Noah sensed her presence. Without saying a word, she slowly sat down on the floor against the wall. She removed her light sweater, folded it into a soft cushion, and gently placed it beside her. Then she rested both hands on her knees and waited. Noah did not look at her immediately. Nearly a full minute passed before he cautiously lowered one hand from his ear. He saw Ava sitting peacefully, making no demands, asking no questions. She smiled softly and tapped the folded sweater once with 2 fingers. Noah hesitated before taking a careful step toward her. Then another. Finally, he sat beside her and rested one hand on the sweater while matching his breathing to the slow, steady rhythm of hers. Within moments, the tightness in his shoulders eased. His hands relaxed. The fear gradually slipped away. Ethan remained standing only a few feet away, watching the scene with quiet amazement. When Noah finally looked up, he reached for his father's hand without hesitation. Ethan knelt beside him, and for the first time in many months, his son leaned gently against his shoulder by choice instead of desperation. Around them, the museum grew strangely quiet as visitors who had witnessed the moment chose silence over curiosity. No speeches were given. No celebration followed. Yet in that peaceful corner beneath the towering skeleton of an ancient whale, Ethan understood that true strength was not measured by commanding a room. Sometimes it was measured by having the patience to make one frightened child feel safe enough to breathe again. Autumn arrived quietly over Chicago, painting the trees surrounding the Romano estate in shades of gold and crimson. Months had passed since that unforgettable evening at the restaurant, and life no longer revolved around waiting for the next difficult day. Noah still faced challenges, but they no longer faced them alone or without hope. His laughter could now be heard drifting through the gardens as he carefully watered the herbs he and Ava had planted together. He had started greeting the kitchen staff every Saturday morning with a shy smile, and on especially good days he even asked his father to join him while building elaborate block towers across the family room floor. Ethan often found himself sitting on the carpet beside his son, leaving business calls unanswered for another few minutes because he finally understood which moments could never be replaced. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Ethan invited the entire household staff into the grand dining room. The long walnut table had been cleared, sunlight poured through the tall windows, and every employee wondered what important announcement was about to be made. Ava stood near the back, convinced she had simply been asked to attend as part of the staff. Ethan entered carrying no prepared speech and no stack of papers. Noah walked beside him, holding the familiar stuffed fox in one hand. Ethan looked around the room before speaking with calm sincerity. "Every person here works hard to make this house function," he began. "But today I want to recognize someone who reminded me that caring for another person begins by paying attention before offering solutions." His eyes found Ava. "You never asked for recognition. You never expected anything in return. You simply saw my son as a child instead of a problem to solve." The room became completely silent. Ava immediately shook her head. "Sir, I only did what anyone should do." Ethan smiled gently. "That is exactly why it matters." He walked toward her and extended his hand, not as an employer acknowledging a worker, but as one human being thanking another with complete respect. Ava accepted the handshake, her eyes filling with quiet emotion. Before either of them spoke again, Noah stepped forward. He looked up at Ava with growing confidence and softly said, "Thank you, Miss Ava." Those 4 words carried more meaning than anyone in the room could fully express. Several employees discreetly wiped away tears. Ethan looked at his son, then back at Ava, realizing that the greatest gift she had given was never the calm evening in the restaurant or the peaceful afternoon at the museum. She had helped a little boy find the confidence to trust the world again, and she had helped a father discover that real strength was found not in power, wealth, or influence, but in patience, humility, and genuine compassion. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished floor, no applause interrupted the quiet. None was needed. Some moments were too meaningful for noise. Ethan watched Noah smiling beside Ava, and for the first time in many years, his home felt warmer than his reputation had ever made it. And on that ordinary autumn afternoon, everyone present witnessed a truth that would remain with them forever. Respect is never earned through status alone. It is earned by choosing kindness when no one expects it. And that day, they all remembered what true dignity looks like.